Hi, everyone. I'm Lindsey Monteith. I'm a clinical research psychologist in the Rocky Mountain MIREC for suicide prevention in Aurora, Colorado. I'm also an associate professor in the School of Medicine and the Department of Psychiatry in the University of Colorado Anschutz Medical Center. So with that, let's move on. All right, my presentation is based upon work supported by the VA and the Rocky Mountain MIREC, but all the views that I will be expressing today are my own. I'd also like to acknowledge several collaborators and team members who've been instrumental in the research I'll be presenting. I think it's fair to say that without them, this work would not be possible. And I'd also like to acknowledge VA R&D for their generous funding of 2 projects that I'll be discussing today, as well as the American Psychological Association, who provided funding for 1 additional project. Many of you are likely aware that the VA released its latest annual suicide data report in November. And as you can see from the figure here, age-adjusted suicide rates among female veterans have continued to exceed those of non-veteran females by more than double. Exceed the difference in suicide rates between veteran and non-veteran men. And this begs the question about what is happening among female veterans that is causing this substantial elevation in suicide rates relative to non-veteran women. While suicide rates have historically been higher among veterans using VA care, this trend has recently shifted. So specifically, the magnitude of the difference in age-adjusted suicide rates between VHA and non-VHA using veterans has decreased over time, and particularly recently. If you look at this by gender, this is especially striking for female veterans, in which the age-adjusted suicide rate among non-VHA veterans actually surpassed that of VHA using veterans in 2017. And I think one thing that's especially important to note about this is, when you think about who the VA traditionally serves, we traditionally have served a sicker population or people with more healthcare needs. And so the fact that this has shifted is just really important to note, and I think might also reflect, very extensive suicide prevention initiatives that have been implemented in the VA in the last several years. Furthermore, the majority of female veterans who have died by suicide each year since 2005, when this has started being tracked really in an extensive and standardized way, they did not actually use VA care in the current fiscal year or the fiscal year preceding their death. So if you look at the bottom row here, in 2018, 72% of the female veterans who lost their lives to suicide had not recently used any VA care prior to their death. And so in order to prevent suicide among more female veterans, I think we need to broaden our focus beyond veterans who are using VA care. In particular, we need to understand why women veterans who are not using VA care are dying by suicide, how they differ from VHA users, and what they need and prefer for decreasing their suicide risk. Even though I won't be focusing on this today, I did want to mention that Claire Hoffmeyer and I in the MIREC, we are co-leading an HSR&D funded grant that will actually be comparing current, past, and never VHA users on their mental health care experiences and barriers, and looking at differences by gender. And so I'm hopeful for the knowledge that we will be getting from that study. Nonetheless, I think it's important to note that research on suicide risk and prevention among women veterans has traditionally just been very limited, and even more so among women veterans not using VA care. And so a critical element to addressing this problem is understanding what are factors driving suicide risk among women veterans, and inclusive of both VHA and non-VHA users. So in today's presentation, I'm going to be focusing on one particular facet of that risk, and specifically trauma. And before I move on, I did want to note, we know that suicide is a complex, multifaceted phenomenon with many different causes. And so I recognize that, but today we'll be focusing on just the trauma aspect. So we know that women veterans report high rates of trauma exposure, and in particular interpersonal violence, and that this isn't specific to any one time point in their lives, but that this actually spans their, for many women, the lifespan. So for some women, this begins in childhood or adolescence, continues into their military service, where we know that military sexual trauma is quite high for women, and in some cases continues following separation from military service. Although interpersonal violence specifically is unfortunately common among women broadly, we know too that women veterans appear to experience particularly high rates of interpersonal violence relative to non-veteran women, and also higher rates of interpersonal violence than veteran men. And while studies vary substantially in terms of the reported rates of interpersonal violence, we recently published a manuscript in the special issue of Medical Care focused on suicide risk and prevention among women, where we reported on rates of interpersonal violence among large samples of women veterans. So my colleague, Dr. Ryan Holliday in the Rocky Mountain MIREC led this effort, and he found that nearly 2/3 of women veterans reported experiencing physical violence in their lifetime, and nearly 2/3 reported experiencing sexual violence in their lifetime. That's really high. And when we looked at violence at specific time periods, we found that women reported especially high rates prior to their military service. Although, as you can see here, rates are still high for during military service as well as following separation. And specifically, these questions asked about abuse for childhood as well as physical and sexual assault during adulthood. And so we also know that within interpersonal violence, there's been a particular focus, and I would even say an abundance of research recently on military sexual trauma specifically, or MST, as it pertains to suicidal self-directed violence. We conducted a narrative review of research in this realm in 2019, and we're struck by several findings. First, studies have generally found that MST is associated with suicidal self-directed violence across a variety of veteran samples. And that doesn't seem to be specific to, any specific gender. It's been found in women, men, and mixed gender samples, as well as in different levels of kind of clinical indication, whether it's veterans seeking treatment or homeless veterans. MST also appears to be associated with the full gamut of self-directed violence outcomes, ranging from suicidal ideation to suicide attempt, and even suicide mortality, although the vast majority of research in this area has focused on suicidal ideation. I also think it's important to point out that although MST can encompass sexual harassment or sexual assault, there is more support for the role of military sexual assault in particular in risk for suicidal self-directed violence. In contrast, there's been less research focused on whether interpersonal violence at other time points, such as prior to or following military service, are associated with suicide risk, or examining whether other forms of interpersonal violence, like physical abuse or physical assault, are associated with risk among women veterans. And we thought this was an important limitation to address, considering that different types of interpersonal violence commonly co-occur in this population. And so this led us, again led by Dr. Holliday, to examine whether sexual and physical violence at different periods were associated with suicidal ideation and suicide attempt at subsequent periods. So our sample for this analysis included 407 women veterans who participated in an anonymous national survey that we conducted online and by mail in 2018 and 2019. Our inclusion criteria were fairly broad. Basically, we targeted female veterans who were ages 18 to 89 who had enrolled in VA care. And we obtained a random sample of 3,000 female veterans from the VA corporate data warehouse, stratified by age and region. And we divided our sample into current VHA users, so those who had used VA care in the past year, past VHA users, so those who had used VA care prior to the past year, and never VHA users, so women who had never used any VA care. And we made this survey anonymous because we knew that we wanted to ask some questions that might be potentially sensitive or in which research has shown that sometimes people feel some stigma around reporting. And we used an abbreviated self-report version of the Self-Injurious Thoughts and Behaviors Interview, or SITB, to examine suicidal ideation and attempt. So what did we find? Pre-military sexual violence was associated with both suicidal ideation and suicide attempts during military service. Pre-military and military sexual violence were also associated with suicidal ideation and suicide attempt following military separation. So sexual violence, irrespective of when it occurred, was associated with suicidal ideation and suicide attempt. On the other hand, physical violence prior to and during military service was associated with suicidal ideation in our models, but not with suicide attempt. And so I think one thing that these findings suggest is that pre-military and military sexual violence are especially pertinent for understanding women and veterans' experiences of suicidal ideation and suicide attempt. So why would that be the case? And in particular, why would that be the case for military sexual trauma? And so I'm going to be discussing some of that next, as that's what some of my research has focused on, MST specifically. So to begin to understand this, we conducted qualitative interviews with MST survivors using an inductive approach to understand women's experiences with MST, the context in which it occurred, and the perceived impact of MST on their lives. Dr. Lisa Brownstone led this manuscript, and for it we interviewed 32 cisgender female veterans who reported experiencing MST. And through thematic analysis, we identified 7 different themes. These are included here. I'm just going to briefly kind of breeze through these, but one thing that you might notice is that I've tried to include a reference at the bottom of each slide in case you're interested in finding out more about any of these studies. So the first theme was that women veterans described sexual harassment as being pervasive and normalized. They also described being disempowered by the experience of MST. Feeling as if maintaining their military career required them to keep silent about what they had experienced. Women described losing trust in other people as a means of protecting themselves from experiencing additional sexual harassment or assault. And they also described internalizing the messages conveyed by MST, such as self-blame, and reported attempting to cope through things like avoidance and escape. For some women, that included engaging in risky behaviors or using substances. And finally, some women described that they found their path to healing and to recovery through pursuing and obtaining justice against the perpetrators, as well as obtaining support and validation from other people, often other service members who were there to support them through this process. So we've used some of these findings and other findings from our qualitative research with MST survivors to inform our subsequent quantitative research to try to understand why MST may be associated with suicidal self-directed violence. And I do think that one thing that is important to also point out here for this slide is that sometimes people ask, how is MST different than sexual trauma or sexual violence that occurs outside the military context? And you can hopefully see here, I think there are some pretty distinct ways in which MST specifically can have a particularly detrimental impact given how intertwined the workplace and personal context are for service members. There we go. Sorry, I got stuck for just a second. All right. So our qualitative findings, as I mentioned, have helped us to also understand the broader institutional and interpersonal context in which MST occurs. So we know that mental health symptoms like depression and PTSD and risky alcohol use, that they are relevant and important for understanding the link between MST and self-directed violence, but that they only partially explain that. They don't fully explain that. So these considerations have led me to really appreciate the need for this broader socio-ecological perspective of what are factors associated with self-directed violence risk among survivors of MST, and to start to consider different risk and protective factors across levels, whether it's the individual or the institutional level. So I just wanted to provide some highlights here about what research has found in this area. So we know that at the individual level, negative post-traumatic cognitions about oneself, fearlessness about death, and beliefs about thwarted belonging and being a burden to others are associated with suicidal ideation or suicide attempt among MST survivors. At the interpersonal level, we've done some research and found that post-deployment social support mediates the association between MST during deployment with suicidal ideation among women veterans, specifically low post-deployment social support. And then in terms of institutional factors, initial research conducted under MIREC suggests that perceptions of institutional betrayal are associated with attempting suicide after experiencing MST. So while there's still research to be done to really fully understand modifiable risk and protective factors for self-directed violence among MST survivors, these findings can help us to get a better sense of kind of a broad range of factors that can help to explain suicide risk following MST. So considering that MST is related to several different mental health and physical health outcomes and comorbidities that we know heighten suicide risk, obtaining treatment for these concerns is critical to mitigating that risk. The potential benefits of treatment for mitigating risk following MST, I think, is really nicely illustrated by a publication by Dr. Rossellini and colleagues. They specifically found that sexual assault was associated with suicide attempts only for female soldiers who did not have a record of mental health treatment in the past year. But, conversely, they looked at whether sexual assault was associated with suicide attempts among women who didn't have, with prior mental health treatment, and they found that this was not significant. And so I think this suggests that mental health care can help to prevent suicide attempts following sexual assault.
Lindsey, I apologize for interrupting. We just got a question. Can you define MST and SSDV? Oh,
absolutely. I'm sorry, I realized that my chat was closed, so thank you for bringing that to my attention. Yes, MST, so I'm using the definition for the VA, which basically refers to sexual assault or repeated sexual harassment that occurs during military service. Suicidal self-directed violence is what I'm referring to when I say SSDV, and that's kind of this broad umbrella term that can encompass different things ranging from suicide attempt, to suicidal behaviors, including suicide itself. And I use that term because it was developed by the CDC in conjunction with the VA, and is the nomenclature that we're being encouraged to use now. I hope that helps. I apologize for not defining them earlier.
Thank you.
No problem. So unfortunately, many women veterans who experience sexual assault forgo or delay health care. And to this point, some of our recent survey findings suggest that military sexual assault is actually associated with lower willingness to use VA care for mental health symptoms among women veterans. We didn't find that for willingness to use non-VA care for mental health or willingness to use care when suicidal. So why would sexual assault survivors or MST survivors delay care or be less willing to seek VA care for mental health concerns? Especially when we consider that the VA provides free MST-related care and really exceptional universal screening for MST, as well as a broad training across the board for providers in how to assess for MST and how to treat MST-related concerns. So those were some of our questions and considerations going into this next study, where we conducted qualitative interviews with 50 MST survivors, including 32 women and 18 men. And most of the veterans in this study described positive perceptions and experiences with VA care. But some of them described concerns about distrust, compassion of providers, privacy, shame, stigma, as well as lack of continuity within their care. And one theme that we noted that was unique to women in our sample was feeling anxious and out of place when they were at VA facilities. And I know that there's been some more recent work that's come out in regard to this last theme by Dr. Clapp and Yano about this. I encourage folks to check out that research if they haven't already. But this led us to propose a model in which we were trying to understand help seeking following MST. Unique to this model is institutional betrayal, which has been defined by Dr. Smith and Freyd as when institutions fail to protect individuals from traumatic events or respond to traumatic events in a harmful manner for trauma that occurs within the context of that institution. And so Dr. Holliday and I proposed that MST-related institutional betrayal impacts beliefs about trust and safety, and that in turn impedes help seeking, especially with respect to use of MST-related care from the VA or other institutions that survivors deem to be affiliated with the military institution in which MST occurred. So we recently tested parts of this model with 242 women veterans who screened positive for MST. This was recently accepted, so results are not quite available yet online, aside from what you see here, but will be forthcoming in psychological trauma, hopefully soon. So in short, we found support for some aspects of our theorized model, while other components of other findings were fairly unexpected. So as we hypothesized, institutional betrayal was associated with lower willingness to use VA medical care. And the association between institutional betrayal and willingness to use VA mental health care was also in a similar direction, but this was not significant. Conversely, institutional betrayal was associated with greater willingness to use non-VA mental health care. Again, emphasizing the import of ensuring that non-VA providers and institutions are both prepared and equipped to serve MST survivors. And what was surprising to us actually was from some of our exploratory aims. And basically for those, we found that institutional betrayal was associated with being more likely to have used VA care in the past year among women who had used VA care at some point. Institutional betrayal was also associated with being more likely to have used VA or non-VA MST-related care. So it may be that for some women, once they are starting to use VA care, that perhaps they're having more positive experiences with care, and that those more immediate or more recent experiences are more influential in their subsequent use of care than these more distal experiences like institutional betrayal. I will point out that as we didn't account for clinical need like current mental health or medical conditions for that study, and so I think that's a really key consideration for future research in this area. And I also think it'd be worth examining if institutional betrayal is associated with help seeking when suicidal. So for example, are MST survivors who experience institutional betrayal less likely to use emergency or crisis services provided by the VA, or are they more reluctant to disclose suicidal intent or suicidal experiences given potential levels of trust required in disclosing those? So research on institutional betrayal as it relates to MST and just veterans broadly is fairly new, but I hope that these additional avenues for research potentially illuminate additional ways in which women trauma survivors may experience risk for self-directed violence. I'm going to shift gears a little bit and focus on firearm access as another way in which experiencing trauma may influence risk for self-directed violence among women veterans. Well, everything that I discussed before, I think that research has been happening for a little bit longer. This area of research, I think, is newer. We've already discussed how experiencing interpersonal violence can influence beliefs about safety, trust, but one of the impacts of that may be acquiring firearms or storing firearms unsafely in order to feel safer against being sexually assaulted or otherwise victimized again. This became apparent to us when we conducted qualitative interviews with 16 women veterans who reported that they had personally owned firearms or lived in a household with firearms present. And the goal of the study was to understand veterans' perspectives and experiences with firearms. I'll mention that men were also enrolled for a separate analysis that was led by Dr. Joe Simonetti in our MIREC, but that there were two themes that emerged that were unique to women veterans. The first is that some women reported having access to firearms through other household members, often their partners or spouses. And then also, even though we didn't ask any questions about trauma or interpersonal violence, those were not an inherent part of the interview guide or even the aims, women described interpersonal violence in relation to their firearm ownership and storage practices. The women veterans described viewing firearms as important for protecting themselves during their military service, in which sexual harassment or assaults were either experienced or threatened. Some women veterans explicitly described this as motivating them to become highly proficient and skilled in using firearms. And following their military service, some women described acquiring firearms to protect themselves from subsequent interpersonal violence like sexual assault. Women veterans who had firearms for protection also described storing their firearms in ways that would make them readily accessible so that they could protect themselves if they needed to. We heard a lot of women report things like storing their firearms next to their beds, on their nightstands, under their pillows, etc. And if you're wondering why we're talking about firearms or why I'm talking about firearms so much, because we know that first, having firearms present, whether they're personally owned or owned by someone else in one's household, are major risk factors for suicide. And we also know that firearms are currently the leading means of suicide among women veterans. So I think these findings are important as they suggest that household members play an important role in women veterans' access to firearms, which is different than for veteran men, in which typically household firearms that are present are personally owned. And then I think these findings also underscore the potential role of interpersonal violence in women veterans' firearm ownership and unsafe storage behaviors, which are also associated with risk for suicide. So I think one thing that you might see as kind of a trend in some of the research that I'm discussing today is initially conducting qualitative research where we try to understand veterans' experiences and perceptions, and then following that up with quantitative tests with larger samples. And that was certainly warranted here. So with that goal in mind, we conducted a secondary analysis of survey data collected by my colleague, Dr. Claire Hoffmeyer, as part of her HSR&D pilot study of women veterans using VA reproductive health care. And in this sample, we looked at a couple different things, but relevant to this presentation, women veterans who experienced military sexual harassment were more likely to report that they had household firearms present. And we also saw fairly high rates of reported firearm ownership and unsafe storage behaviors within this sample. We'll also be examining this further with primary data using survey data that we collected in 2020 with 545 previously deployed women veterans. And for this study, we plan to examine if experiences during, preceding, and following deployment, including sexual violence, but also things beyond that like combat and general harassment, if they're associated with women veterans' firearm ownership, and also if safety-related beliefs explain that association. And I'm happy to say that we have a team of very dedicated individuals who are working really hard to finish up data cleaning so that we can move on to data analysis, and we're hoping to have those findings available later this year, as well as some findings on looking at firearm ownership in the context of COVID, given the timing of the survey. Finally, one major limitation of research on suicide prevention among women veterans is that there's generally been really a lack of suicide prevention interventions that have been tailored by gender. I know there have been some calls recently for more research in this area, but given some of the gender differences and rates in drivers of firearm access among veterans, tailored firearm lethal means safety interventions for women veterans in particular, I think are really important or have quite a bit of potential. So I'm really grateful that VHSR&D has funded us to collect a pilot study where we will, or where we are interviewing women veterans, their spouses or partners, as well as VA mental health and primary care providers, with an overarching goal of obtaining knowledge that's, I think, essential to understand how we can start to better prevent suicide by firearm among women veterans. And so as you can see here in this diagram, really trying to highlight that the area in which we'll be able to best do this is by synthesizing the experiences of women veterans, their family members, and then VA providers. And one aspect of this study is exploring the extent to which women veterans' perspectives, their experiences, and their preferences for firearm access and firearm lethal means safety, whether those differ based on their history of interpersonal violence, and particularly MST and intimate partner violence. And this will help us to understand the extent to which different firearm lethal means safety efforts need to be tailored based on interpersonal violence history, in ways in which we could potentially address this, starting with getting a sense of what female veterans think about this and their preferences for care. So I look forward to hopefully sharing those findings here again in the future. I'd like to conclude by highlighting a few key points. First, trauma and especially sexual violence appears to be important for understanding suicidal self-directed violence in women veterans. It's my personal opinion that given the prevalence of interpersonal violence in women veterans and associations between interpersonal violence sequelae with suicide risk, that preventing interpersonal violence and addressing trauma-related sequelae are critical to preventing suicide among women veterans. And part of this may entail addressing the broader institutional context in which interpersonal violence occurs. And related to that, validating women veterans' experiences of violence, helping them to get support and seek out recourse subsequently. And that is, I think, in line with many of the broader DoD ZEPRO initiatives that have been happening, in which they've really been trying to make strides toward this in different ways. In addition, interpersonal violence may have ramifications for women veterans' suicide risk through safety-related beliefs and firearm access, including unsafe storage behaviors. But additional research is needed and is underway to examine this further and to determine how to begin to prevent firearm-related suicide among women veterans, inclusive of those who have experienced interpersonal violence. Finally, sorry, I just realized that. There we go. Although the V offers unparalleled resources for screening for MST and addressing military sexual trauma sequelae, some women veterans prefer to use non-VA care, which in part may be due to institutional betrayal, likely is also due to other factors. So considering this, as well as the fact that the majority of women veterans who died by suicide did not receive VA care prior to their death, continued educational efforts to ensure that non-VA providers and institutions are aware of women veterans' needs and experiences and well equipped to address those needs and risk factors are essential. Several areas of future research, I think, are necessary to illuminate how to prevent suicide among women veterans who've experienced trauma. And this includes better understanding interactions between different experiences across the lifespan and spanning different socio-ecological contexts. So again, things that can be targeted at the individual level, interpersonally, by potentially engaging family members, friends, coworkers, et cetera, as well as institutionally. There also remains a need to understand if suicidal self-directed violence interventions and even assessment methods need to be tailored by gender and trauma history, and if so, how this can optimally occur. And I think some of these considerations are all the more important within the context of the current COVID pandemic, in which we know that women have described being disproportionately affected in a lot of different ways. Finally, I did want to recommend that anyone interested in learning more about some really exciting recent research on suicide risk and prevention among women, check out the recent Medical Care Journal supplement published this month, which includes some very interesting findings and which is available for free online. I included some different snapshots of some of the article titles here just to reflect, I think, just how much hope there is around the potential impact of these new findings to really increase awareness of suicide risk and prevention among women and women veterans in particular. So with that, I think we can open it up to questions and comments, but I also wanted to include my email address up here. If anyone would like to continue this conversation further or has any questions, please feel free to send me an email. And then there's also the website for our Rocky Mountain MIRET for veteran suicide prevention, where we have many different educational resources available, as well as resources for providers on suicide risk management and free consultation for both VA and non-VA providers. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you. We do have several pending questions here, so I'm just going to dig in from the top. For the audience, if you do have any questions, please use that Q&A screen in WebEx to submit those questions into us. The first question that we have here, are the differences between VA and non-VHA using women, are they statistically significant?
I'm wondering if that question is specific to the data I presented earlier.
Yes, it came in at about 5 minutes into your presentation, so very early in the session.
Oh, great. Thank you. So to my knowledge, the VA suicide data reports are just kind of reporting on the broad rates, and I don't know that for this specific slide, which you can see up, that those differences were examined in terms of statistical significance, especially for the 2018 rates between female VHA and non-VHA veterans. I don't want to comment on that because I don't know the answer, but you know, the rate was, age-adjusted rate was 17 versus 14 per 100,000. Sorry, I don't have a more clear answer for that.
Nope, that's fine. We can't expect you to know everything. That's just not how research works. Okay, the next question here. Do we know about the comorbidities associated with these women veterans who attempted to suicide? Did they develop PTSD or substance use before their suicide attempts? And if so, what was the percentage affected?
I'm wondering which findings that question pertains to.
Came in about 11:17, so about 15 minutes into your presentation.
Okay. I mean, I know that we found that, I know that there is research that has examined PTSD and substance use in relation to suicidal self-directed violence among women veterans, and that there have been findings in terms of some gender differences in that area, and finding that I think that the PTSD substance use interaction in particular may be associated with particularly heightened risk. This isn't something that we've explicitly sought out within our research specifically. I do think the PTSD and substance use are both important in that risk.
Okay, thank you. Next question here. Have the effects on employment or lack of also been studied in relations to suicidality and MST?
I am not aware of any research that's looked at employment like as a potential mediator of the MST Suicide Risk Association. I think that would be something that would be great to look at. I do know that research has found that unemployment and unemployment concerns are major risk factors for suicide broadly, not specific to MST. And we also know that veterans who experience MST do report a pretty broad range of psychosocial difficulties, including joblessness or employment challenges. So I think that would be a great area for future research.
Great, thank you. Our next one here is not a question. Somebody wanted to send in a resource. They wanted folks to be aware of the VA Vet Center program, which provides no-cost counseling for veterans in active duty with regards to military sexual trauma, PTSD, anger management, depression, anxiety, grief and loss, and MFT. And that information can be found at vetcenter.va.gov. their phone number is just 877-WAR-VETS.
Thank you. I think that is a really important addition to note. The vet centers, I think, are able to provide, have some unique characteristics that may be especially appealing to MST survivors. So one is related to privacy concerns, since they don't document, since VA providers, I believe, don't have access to the vet center notes in the same way. So thank you for mentioning that.
We're getting a lot of comments in here, which is always fun. It's kind of a conversation. We have another comment here. Some healthcare providers are not taking it seriously. VA has a bad practice of removing a therapist who has established a relationship, causing further distrust.
I'm really sad for any instances in which that's occurred. And I know that the VA has really been trying hard to provide education and training to all providers on, how to best provide care for MST survivors and things that are really important within that. And I think within some of our research, we found that, continuity of care, which includes continuing to work with providers where trust and rapport have been established, has been described as being especially important.
Thank you. Okay, the next question here. What is the percentage of participants that identify as a BIPOC?
Well, I don't know which, presented a lot of different studies. For our studies of women veterans, I believe I want to say been about 10%, but I'm not sure offhand.
Okay. Thank you. The next question here. What ideas do you have for how our system might address institutional betrayal before services are needed?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. So how can our institutions begin to address institutional betrayal early before there's a need for healthcare services? I think one way really aligns with kind of a trauma-informed care approach, so making sure that institutions are set up in a way where they're really welcoming for everyone, including MST survivors, but just broadly for all people, and where the messages kind of within an environmental setting convey that. And I think that's very much consistent with some of the recent VA efforts that have been implemented around like campaigns to reduce harassment at VA facilities. And I would say that these efforts would be important not just for VA facilities, but for other institutions as well.
Great, thank you. Okay, the next question here. What about the role of peer support? It seems that the field of peer support has few female veterans. As peer support specialists, I have advocated for this, but it seems that the response is not where we would like it to be. Thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's, again, another really, really important point. I think peer support specialists have tremendous potential, to help their fellow veterans, and I know there are certainly instances in which that bond can be different in many ways from healthcare providers who haven't necessarily had some of those same experiences. And I know in some of the research that we've conducted within our MIREC, and also that others outside of our MIREC have conducted, some women veterans have conveyed, preferences for wanting to work with other women to a greater extent than men for providers specifically. And I know in some of the research that we've conducted, qualitatively, this has also come up in terms of disclosing suicidal ideation. So I think that's an important point. It's a little bit beyond my pay grade, though, I'm not sure, what the best avenues would be for addressing this further, but I do think it's a really important point.
Thank you. The next question here, how do you think LMS should be adapted for women?
I think we are trying to figure that out with our current pilot study. I mean, I can say offhand, I do think that one way is potentially involving household members, since we know that for many women veterans, their access to firearms might be through a spouse or partner. And I don't know that we fully understand how to best go about reducing their firearm access if their firearms are not their own, but rather are owned by someone else. And then if you further add into the context that there might be concerns about intimate partner violence, how do you go about engaging household members in those efforts, or do you, and what does that look like? So I think that's something that we really hoped to be able to have a better answer to in about a year or a year and a half.
Great, thank you. Okay, the next question. Are you aware of any differences in IB or effects of IB related to a veteran's degree of affiliation or identification with the military or military culture? For instance, for some, the military serves as more than employment, but also a family and one's identity.
I don't have an answer to the latter part of the question specifically, but I will say that I'm currently working with a graduate student, Iglesias, and she actually just conducted or is hoping to do preliminary work kind of looking at that. And for the preliminary analysis that we ran, we actually we looked to see if there was an interaction between institutional betrayal and level of perceived closeness with the military institution in which MST occurred. And we did not find that interaction to be significant. So institutional betrayal was associated with bad outcomes regardless of how close women reported feeling to the military institution.
Great, thank you. We have gotten in several questions looking for a copy of today's slides. That link was included in the reminder that was sent out this morning. If you just scroll down a little bit, it's closer to the bottom, but that link is included in there. If you cannot find that link in there, or if you don't have that reminder, you will also be able to access the slides from the reminder, or I'm sorry, from the archive email when that is sent out. Okay.
Oh,
I'm sorry.
Sorry, go ahead.
Next question. Are you ready for it?
Yes.
What does cisgender mean?
Oh, when someone's sexual identity matches their gender identity.
Oh, thank you. Okay, next question here. Can you show the slide that detailed 81 female vets that used VHA compared to 210 vets that did not use VHA care? Was that suicide attempts or ideation?
That was suicide death. Yeah. So this was female veterans who died by suicide in 2018.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Sorry, I was just going to say which the VA, they track this in a standardized way systematically every year and report on it every year.
Okay, next question here. What kind of training can we encourage medical staff to take in order to receive helpful trauma-informed practices?
Yeah, I think there are some trainings within TMS that focus on trauma-informed care. And then I also think, well, I know the MST support team provides different trainings both monthly as well as I believe on their website, and they have a site that includes a lot of those different trainings online. And I would encourage folks to check that out because I think they have a lot of tremendous wonderful resources for addressing that, including trauma-informed care. I also wanted to mention Tim Avery posted that VA's new app Beyond MST will be released soon. So just mentioning that too as a potential resource.
Great. And I actually was just going to mention the same thing there, so perfect. So that actually is going to wrap up our questions. Lindsey, I just wanted to check to see if you had any closing remarks you'd like to make before we close the session out.
I just wanted to thank everyone for their interest in this area. I think it's really important to increase awareness and, you know, that we're really all working together to address this in different ways. So thank you for everyone for being here today and for the great work that you're doing as well. And thank you, Heidi, and to Sprint.
Thank you. We definitely, and it was wonderful having you present today. We really do appreciate the time that you put into this. I don't think I have anyone on from Sprint on the call to close things out right now, but we will get them on the call for the next session here.
Yeah, this is Teresa Hudson from Sprint.
Hi, Teresa. There we go.
Yeah, so I just want to thank our speaker today. It was very useful and informative, and thank everybody for attending. And we look forward to offering our next presentation. I believe in a couple months.
We'll have that information out to everyone as soon as we get it in our hands here. To the audience, just as a reminder, if you could hang out for a minute or two, when I close the meeting out, you will be prompted with a feedback form. We really do appreciate your feedback so we can continue to provide high-quality sessions for you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you at a future HSR&D Cyber Seminar. Thank you, everyone.